we have a couple of guests who will be joining us and sharing just from their own hearts today. One is Pastor James Roberson from Brooklyn, Bridge Church, NYC. And the second is Rich Villodas, who is a pastor in Queens at New Life Fellowship. And so, James, maybe you can start us off. I know that obviously at the end of May, with everything that's been happening towards this awakening towards racial injustice and a real heart for justice. And I know that you were such a significant leader in this kind of season for our city with Pray March Act, with you, which you and Justin helped pioneer along with so many others. And so I would love to hear from you, just kind of what are you sensing about what's next and what opportunities are there for New York City pastors to really galvanize around the work of justice and prayer?
Yeah. Well, thank you again for convening this, Drew, and honored to be on here with all of you. If I could share my screen, can I do that, Drew? Okay. I hope you guys can see that pretty well. I kind of want to just ground us in how we came about with Pray March Act, and I love the theme of this is what is God saying? Because for several years as a church plant in New York City, the struggle was figuring out, how do we activate our people doing things for the sake of justice? And so I kind of want to ground us in theologically how we came to these conclusions. And then we can, at the end of this time, go towards some action steps. One of the things that Ibram Kendi brings up in his book, Becoming an Anti-Racist, he says a racist culture normalizes racial disparities by ignoring American history and placing no emphasis on racist policies. So essentially, when you deal with racism as a whole and normalizing racism, we're just basically saying the inequities that we see and the disparities that we see, they're kind of a rhythm in our culture that we begin to assume are normal. I used to live in Park Slope when I first moved here, and when I was there at a PS10 on Prospect Ave, part of the block was gentrified and part of the block was not gentrified. As we walked up to the street and went to PS10, we lived on Prospect Ave, and PS10 was there. We would go to find out that the PTA there, the collective budget was $1 million. So anything they wanted to do, if they wanted to do like a play, they would get people from Sesame Street. If they wanted to do some music, they'd get people from Broadway. And if they wanted to do dance, they'd get people from Alvin Ailey. We ended up moving to Flatbush because we wanted to move our church there. And so we took our kids to PS 315. And then when we did that, when we went into PS 315, we went to have our kids in there and we saw the PTA budget was $40, not 40,000, not 400, $40. And it was actually negative $40, but then we found $80 somewhere lying around, and that's how we ended up at 40. And my wife and I were the president and co-president of the PTA, so that's how we know. But this was just normal, and this is how we consider things normal in our society, where there is gun violence, where there's police brutality, where there's health disparities, whether there is school and education disparities. We see these things as normal. Even the way that COVID-19 affected our communities, we've come to normalize this as just the way things are. And so I just want to root us kind of in two places scripturally as we think about who we've become as Pray March Act. One, I think about the way that Jesus dealt with that moment in John chapter 9. They were passing by and they saw a blind man from birth, and his disciples asked him who sinned, right? There's a lot of reasons we could get into why they asked that question. But when you look at the chronology of miracles throughout the Gospels, this was the first time they had ever thought to ask this question. But this wasn't the first blind man that Jesus actually healed. He had healed several blind men. He had done many miracles. He had even dealt with the man at the pool of Bethesda. But they didn't ask this question. But they had seen so much that they finally felt like they needed to ask the question, who sinned? This man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answers, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, night is coming when no one can work. And so you see this emphasis that Jesus makes on work in light of a man that was blind. Essentially, Jesus responds by acknowledging you guys are asking the wrong question. They got caught up in, how did this person get into this situation? Was it his family structure? Was there something his family did? Was this something that was passed on? Was this own personal responsibility? Is this something he got caught up in? Many commentators would say that this oftentimes someone would become blind because of gonorrhea and because there was no other kind of medication for that time. So maybe the disciples had seen him from his youth and maybe knew his story. But at the end of the day, Jesus doesn't get into the personal story or the systemic family story. He points to the disciples and says, this is our work. He says, this has happened so that there can be a work done in his life. And then if you look there in verse 4, he says, we must work. We must work. This is the church's work. This is the disciples' work. This man was born blind in an ailment, in a fractured culture, in a sin-bound culture, and we are a part of restoring this man to who God has intended him to be. So Christ charges the church in doing the work in the community. And I think one of the things that you begin to see is, especially, the way that I came up in a kind of an evangelical framework in my training, is if you really look at the way that the evangelical church has not gotten in the game of justice and activism, a lot of times it's presumed that if someone lives in another part of their borough, or there's other issues, other disparities in another part of the cities, that's their work to do, and so we kind of see we have certain churches that focus on trying to be attractional. We have other churches that see themselves as missional. But I think that we need a reimagining of urban missiology, where we see ourselves connecting with people who are doing all types of work with people with ailments or health or any other kind of disparity. But we don't need to be caught up in any political conversation on how this situation came about. Rather, we should be looking at our job description as ones in which we should be engaged in the work. The other verse I just want to point to briefly is, in Isaiah, when this community of God is fasting, right? And they're asking to see God do something in their midst. If you remember this chapter in Isaiah, they're begging God, they're fasting, and the Lord responds by telling them, this is not the fast that I choose. And then he says in Isaiah 58:7, is it not to share your bread, right? With the hungry, bring the homeless, pour into your house. When you see the naked, to cover him. But I think the key part, he says, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. And so these are Jewish people he's speaking to a Gentile, he's speaking about a Gentile nation, and he calls them their own flesh. So in many ways, he says, you must adopt them into your community and treat them like you'd be your own family. And to a Jewish community who is very interwoven as a family dynamic, in a Jewish community, it was not individualistic. If one person in the family was struggling, they were all struggling. And we don't have that vision as pastors often, that if there's one part of our city and there's pastors in that city that are struggling, that we're all struggling, that we don't have a kingdom vision for our boroughs, that we're all thinking about the borough, that we're all caring for it. But I think we've segregated ourselves and say, well, that's their problem. Well, how did they get into that situation? And so this has always been a challenge. And sometimes we have theological differences. But at the end of the day, we should be trying to galvanize churches to be able to have a kingdom impact. And so what we wanted to do at Pray, March, Act was to be able to have a model of churches collectively coming together in boroughs, and hopefully it can be a model for the nation, so that we can see this cross-pollinating of resources and skills and talent, and then all pushing them towards ending racial disparities, ending inequities, breaking the yoke that we see in our cities. This came about, some of you guys know, on June 2nd of 2020 is when we had the march, and our hope was, Justin hit me up one day and he called me and he said, man, we gotta, we see all these marches and it's just non-believers doing them, and the church has something to say. And that's really what he said. The church has something to say. And I was like, man, I don't know. And so I went and talked to the Holy Spirit, which is also known as my wife. And she was like, yeah, you can do it. And so I was like, cool. So after I finished talking to her, we went and we started organizing. And to be honest with you, we thought we were going to get maybe 100 churches. That would have been great. We still don't know how many churches out there. There are all types of numbers for the thousands of people that were out there. But we felt like God was doing something beyond what we had planned, which was just in a march. And so I went after this march. There was a lot of attention coming our way, and people wanted us to speak on certain things, but we had kind of adopted this narrative of being an organization. I went away for 5 weeks. That I actually already had a sabbatical laid up for me from my church. And I went away for 5 weeks. And honestly, I prayed, and that's when God kind of placed things together that we had been trying to do in our church, and really just took it out of my church's realm and into more of a kingdom realm. And so what I shared with you before is what really God gave me. What I didn't want to be was kind of, I don't know if you saw that thing called the Fire Festival, where because there was a lot of attention on a person, they started to do all these different things and events and whatnot. And we didn't want to be kind of an evangelical fire festival just because we were having a lot of attention on us. We didn't want to utilize that as momentum because we didn't want human momentum. We wanted to be a spiritual movement. So we just went away and sought God. And it was from there that framework of seeing Isaiah, of seeing that blind man, and then putting some action steps. So several things that we felt like we wanted to do from there. Our movement really was a lot of millennials. And so we know that millennials hang out on social media. And so what we did was we ended up creating Pray March Act, the Instagram handle. If you go there, you'll see, if you look to the left here, you'll see that's the handle. We have kind of a layout of theology, being able to lay out if is protest biblical. We also have prayers of lament for people like Jacob Blake and Trayford Pellerin. We also are able to highlight people like Breonna Taylor. But we're trying to disciple people in the area of justice online because we felt like there was a progressive wing that was kind of defining the way that we were responding to these issues of injustice. So we put that out there because in the same way that earlier I was talking about anchoring this in the word, we want to anchor our people in the word. And so we do that. We also have a curriculum that we're creating right now because, again, we feel like a lot of times these instances happen in society. The knee-jerk reaction is to give people books, but we want to give people training. We think, I'm not just saying this because Rich is on here, but we really think that what Pete Scazzaro did for emotions, we want to help people do with justice because we feel like people don't need just books on justice. We think they need to get trained in justice. We think this is a discipleship issue. We think we need, again, a re-envisioning of urban missiology and unleashing people to do missions, not just in their community, but the borough as a whole. So in light of that, what we created is an action meeting. We have several people. I saw Pastor Galbraith from Clarendon Road. He will be speaking. We also have Pastor Edwin Colon. He will be speaking at that. Another Pastor Tyrone Stevenson. He will be speaking. And all of this is not just so that they would speak, but that we would be creating action steps for people to do. And we just feel like we just got to keep praying and talking together about the current issues that we have. And another pastor, Pastor J.C. Morales of Park Slope Christian Tabernacle, will also be there. It will be streaming on PrayMarchAct.com. The website will go live in a few days. Right now, the website will just bring you to a Facebook page. So we'll be streaming on there. It'll be streaming through YouTube. We'll be filming it out of my church building. So again, you can go to Pray March Act on Instagram. You'll see, they'll get equipped. You can, whenever there's something that happens, you can look at what's happening there, and it'll equip you with prayers. It'll equip you with theological insight and historical insight. None of this stuff we're doing is for free. So if you'd like to give and support what we're doing, you can go to Pray March Act at Venmo. And that will help us support us. Right now, my church is footing a lot of the bill for this, praise God. But any support will be dope. And then again, PrayMarchAct.com is where you'll be able to get in a few days, we'll get the website going live. Until then, our Instagram will have most of the information.
Thanks, James, for sharing that. I would love to also just hear how are you doing, man? Your soul in all of this, especially as
What's that?
I'm so glad. I mean, because you were so on the forefront, and I loved just following your lead everything that was happening. And I know you went on sabbatical and stuff. Would love to just hear how has God been speaking to you as you're now, it sounds like we're gearing up for the long struggle in this area. I would love to hear just your soul and how things are going and what you're feeling.
Yeah. I prepared to talk about stuff, not my life, man.
No, yeah.
I feel you. To be honest with you, man, I would say right when I got back off sabbatical, we had, I really feel like for some reason, you remember that song, The Freaks Come Out at Night? Remember that song back in the day? You don't, Drew? Some people on here do. The wolves come out of COVID. I mean, the wolves come out of quarantine, man. They just, there were just certain people who just were laying in wait. And I think the fact that we weren't gathering, there's just the ministry of presence just coming together. There was a reality to certain people using their influence while I wasn't around, to be honest with you. And, that rocked me. It just rocked me. So COVID was one thing, but coming back to, people leaving was, and people being influenced to leave was just shocking to me. I think, we use certain terms like the rug was pulled out from under me, or I was blindsided, in order to just talk about the pain of people who you love not meeting your expectations. So to be honest with you, man, the first week back was just church stuff, man. Just being hurt and having to recalibrate and deal with loss and just being able to grieve that. So along with COVID and all this other stuff, I mean, I think that was the most surprising. I just wasn't prepared for that. Even though I was rested, I wasn't prepared. So it took me several weeks just to process that. And I think what I learned from that is it's hard to be someone's friend, father figure, and pastor all at the same time. And if you remember that story, Jada Pinkett and Will Smith, they talked about being entangled. And I think in some ways, I found myself maybe holding on to people too long and not allowing there's a beauty in departure, because when you define everyone as a lifer, you almost tether them to you as if you're God and as if your church is the summation of the kingdom, when in reality, everybody's life works in seasons. Everybody's life works in seasons. Probably nobody on this call has been in one church their whole life. And so if that's the case for most of humanity, that we work in seasons, that means that people work in seasons, and it won't be only because they got a job or only because, they're moving. Sometimes it'll be because, my sheep, Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice. And there's a reality that sometimes as a shepherd, they just don't hear your voice anymore. Now I've got to analyze that. I've got to own my mistakes in that. But I've also got to realize that my leadership, my personality, and my skill set just cannot fulfill all that people need. And so, I think I tagged some people as lifers, and they were seasoners, and most people are seasoners. Very few people are lifers. And so I just had to own that and the reality of that. I need Rich to come out with a book on how to exit a church. If he could just, the emotionally healthy exiting, if he could come out with that, that would be amazing. Because for some reason, when people leave, they either say nothing or they say everything. You know, everything they've been wanting to say. Like, oh man, they pitching fastballs with high heat. So you know, I had several of that, and that just was what it was. I would say for the last 2 weeks, I have been more excited about and I'm not saying this to put a bow on it. Yeah. I'm just saying this is really where I'm at. I have been more excited about doing ministry now than I ever have been, because I honestly believe that one person in a meeting can bring 80% of the stress, right? And just one person, like everybody can be great, but one person, like one email can take up half your energy of the day. One text message, you know? And I just had one here and one here and one here. And those people ended up leaving. And I'm not saying I'm glad they're gone. I didn't realize how hard it was to lead people, because I was trying to love. I thought, honestly, I just treated it like a marriage, almost like, you ain't never leaving me, you know? No, you need to go. You know, it's just, and the terminology I use now is alignment. Because I think you can have misunderstanding, and a misunderstanding is, yo, we need to talk through this. Then you can have disagreement, and a disagreement is we're talking about it and we just don't see eye to eye. But then there's misalignment, and misalignment is I've come to the conclusion that you're going in a different direction. And the way that I understand that is that our disagreement is now defining our relationship. Like this disagreement is almost like summarizing who we are together. And when you have misalignment, you have to have reassignment. You know, you just have to help people. You have to offer them another vision. And I mean, oftentimes it's another place, but and I'm not saying, I don't even know if I know how to do what I'm saying. I just know I can't keep holding on to people that I know want to go, but are only staying, not because of the leadership of the church, but because of the community of the church. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then there's people who leave, but they stay. You know, they still hang around the church, but they don't. And I'm like, that's like breaking into my parents' house just to get food, but then ignoring them. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. Anyway, you asked me. I don't know why.
Oh man, I think so many of us can relate to just, this season, the Wolves comment you made, you know.
It's crazy.
Yeah. The people challenges, and, you know, not only my own stress and difficulty, but leading in the confusion and the difficulty amidst so much anxiety within our congregation. So, man, thanks for sharing and still leading through this in a significant way, man. Especially with Pray March Act. Again, those links were dropped in the chat box.
Great.
For those of you guys. And Rich Villodas, the lead pastor at New Life Fellowship, actually just came out with a book called A Deeply Formed Life. And it came out yesterday, and I got my copy. I've been waiting for this book. Rich is one of just a significant voice for this next generation. And I'm just grateful to be his friend and to see him in his ministry and his life. And he's also a great 3-point shooter. If anyone's ever played ball with him, he's like a lefty sniper from the 3-point line. So Rich, would just love to hear your book, really, you know, as we talk about all of these different initiatives moving forward, and even as James gave us a window into his own soul, and so many pastors nowadays, I'd love to hear from you about just why you wrote The Deeply Formed Life, as well as the key areas of life that you address in it. Would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, and first of all, I'm just, James, so thankful for you. And you and I have exchanged many text messages on various topics, and appreciate your voice in our city. Appreciate the banter we can have around sports and all that there. So just appreciate your presence in the city. And same with you, Drew. You and I go back 12 years in relationship, and just grateful for all that you're doing, especially in convening spaces like this. Why did I write it? I wrote it for a number of reasons. Number one, I like to think that my primary reason for writing it was pastoral in nature. When I think about Eugene Peterson, when he wrote the Message translation, it started off as a Bible study through the book of Galatians. And he was trying to get his congregation to understand the book of Galatians. And they were like, I don't have a clue what this means. So he said, let me translate it in language that would be culturally acceptable or just understandable. And so he started just by the book of Galatians for his church. And then it started expanding out of that. And so the Message came out of pastoral concern for people to grow in their life with God and in love for the scriptures. I like to think that's the primary motivation why I wrote this book, because the 5 values I write about are values that our church holds dear. We call them our 5 M's. And so I wanted to use different language to speak to a context outside of New Life. But I wrote it primarily because of our congregation. People were coming in, and I realized while we did have great content in terms of contemplative life and emotional health, I realized in the area of race, the area of sexuality, the area of mission and justice, we did not have codified theology and formational frameworks for our congregation. And I found myself repeating things over and over again when I can just say, hey, there's a resource here if you really want to dive into it. This is what we've said. This is what I've said here. And so I wrote it primarily for the congregation as a pastor. But I wrote it also because these are values that have impacted me profoundly for the past 21 years. I'm 41 years old. I became a Christian at 19, 22 years. And I was introduced to the contemplative tradition at 21 by reading the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and started going to monasteries at 22 and was enamored with these things. So these are things that I think about, every single day. And I wrote it because it's pastoral for me, for our congregation, but these are things that give me life. And I think in terms of why I wrote it, if you guys are into Enneagram stuff, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. And, sevens, the sin of the 7 is gluttony. And I'm doing okay at this point here, although my stomach is, anyway. However, that is, I can be in so many different spaces. And so, but this is a delightful book to write for a 7, because I'm not just in one place. I'm talking about 5 different things with 20 something different practices and such. So it was just a delight for me to write it for pastorally, because I've been shaped by these values, and because of my Enneagram 7, shadow side, if you will, or personality.
For someone who knows you, you're definitely like this urban monk from from East New York, Brooklyn, and it's been fun just seeing your journey and seeing how you really have tried to live this out. I'd love to hear, you explore the importance of slowing down and finding healthy spiritual rhythms. You talked about kind of 21, you were introduced to the contemplative tradition. Can you just share, why is interior examination helpful? And a lot of the common churchy advice is to just focus on Christ, so we don't get too inward focused. Can you just share more about the inward journey, the contemplative, why it's so important for our city, for this time, and maybe a good first step for listeners to take?
If I can quote the inimitable poet Ice Cube, he said, "You better check yourself before you wreck yourself." And so, when I think about, or Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. When I think about interior examination, and, interior examination is about living in reality. And there's so much unreality that we're living in, because we are not aware of what's happening inside of our own selves. And so here's the irony. We can be sociologically adept and theologically astute. We can know what has been said throughout history, theologically, intellectually, and yet be strangers to ourselves. And then out of being a stranger to ourselves, we start projecting onto the world the unresolved material that's inside of us. And so I think the reason why it's so important is because, you know, Parker Palmer, good Quaker author, would say that we are either projecting light or shadow into the world. And we are either contributing to the wholeness of the world or contributing to its ongoing fragmentation. And one of the ways we do that is by the lack of interior examination, which is why for me, the Gospel of Luke in chapter 4 is really instructive about this. I like to think of that passage where Jesus is in the wilderness as a time when, yes, Jesus is discerning and being tested about the kind of Messiah he's going to be. But wrapped in that, I think, is some significant interior examination that Jesus was doing, where the evil one is saying, if you are the Son of God, do this, do this, do that. And Jesus is wrestling with his own self in terms of what kind of Messiah am I going to be? And it is out of that place of prayer and introspection and self-examination that he comes out with incredible clarity and with anointing to speak on justice, to break the chains, to set the captives free, to give sight to the blind. And so, I mean, to the degree that I'm aware of what's happening on the inside is the degree that I'm going to love well and live free. And if I'm not aware of it, you know, it's going to lead to greater fragmentation. And so a step, you know, when I think about this, let me just give you a current example. One of the ways I think we could do this is by paying attention to our anxiety and the various ways that it manifests. A couple months ago, as we were thinking about returning to our in-person worship, there was a moment when lots of stress came my way because there was an internal staff conflict about wearing masks inside the building. Not for everyone. Everyone was going to wear masks, but whether I, as the preacher, should be wearing a mask and the worship team should be wearing a mask. And the amount of conflict within the staff that this brought up, it was significant. And it got to a point when I said to a staff member, you know what, I have not decided yet if I'm going to wear a mask or not, because everything's virtual at this point. But that was, you know, we were going to let people in, you know, at 25%. There's going to be, 70, 80 people in the room. And I remember saying, I haven't decided yet. And one of the staff members had a visceral reaction to me. And it was pretty intense. And in that moment, I was like, first of all, absorbed in the intensity of the moment. And I saw myself. One of the gifts of Zoom is you see yourself, especially if you don't have the hide self speaker part up. And I saw myself already kind of like this, like taking my glasses off, like okay, like I'm shifting because I'm ready. And then I saw myself going, this is not the best posture for this. And so I put my glasses back on and folded my hands and all that there. And the conversation, and I was a bit abrupt in that meeting. And at the end of it, my body was just, I was riddled with anxiety. Why did that person respond that way? How could that person respond that way? What am I going to do now? I realized I needed to have a follow-up conversation with this person. But for the next few days, I noticed my breathing was really tight. And I was, to get a satisfying breath, I don't know if you've ever been there, but there are moments where I can't get a satisfying breath. And I can't do, for whatever reason, it's just congested and tight in there. And I couldn't make the connection. Can't breathe. What's going on here? And that went on for about 4 or 5 days. And then I sat down. I remember there were 4 or 5 days where I didn't do that kind of interior examination. And I sat down to pay attention to my anxiety by paying attention to my body. What am I concerned about? And it got very clear. I'm concerned that if I speak to this person, this person is going to respond in a particular way. I'm not going to be liked. And listen, the more the pandemic goes on, the less people are liking me based on some of the decisions I'm making. So I'm just like, whatever it is. But I got to a point where I journaled. This is my journal right here. And I journaled maybe 2 pages of anxiety. What am I afraid of? And okay, this is the conversation I'm going to have. And I had the conversation 2 days later. And it was very difficult. It wasn't easy. And I had to decide who's leading this church here. But I want to stay relationally connected. That's good differentiation. And in terms about the departure and exiting stuff, for me, that's a question of what James is bringing up. This is about differentiation, which is a good family systems theory term about remaining close to yourself and remaining close to others in times of high anxiety, and not going down the road of enmeshment or cutting people off. I typically go down the road of cutting people off. You don't want to be here, later for you. I'll never see you again. And even though I'm hurt, even though whatever it is. And so I did that work and then had the conversation. And it wasn't like wonderful, but I realized this is the conversation I had to have. But if I was not identifying my anxiety, Drew, and the ways that it manifests in my body and my need to control and my need to avoid, I know anxiety is rising to the surface when I start avoiding people. And there's a guy, I'll respond this way, Drew, and then maybe if there's any other questions. There's a guy who used to go to our church at New Life, who lives maybe 3 blocks from me. And he didn't like some of the stuff I said about white supremacy, so he left. I realized, because I see him maybe once every 4 or 5 weeks. And when I see him, my initial response, thank God we have masks on. We can't even recognize each other these days. So I have my mask, I put my hat down, boom. I was like, I don't even want to see this brother, you know? And I realized this is a point of anxiety for me, because why am I avoiding this guy? I'm not living free right now. And so part of me feels like the next time I see him, Lord, I hope I don't see him, but the next time I see him, you know, I need to just say, just besides hello, just to check in. But if I'm hiding from someone or avoiding a conversation, it's just showing that anxiety still has the best of me and I'm not free. So monitoring anxiety is just one of the ways that I think is important for our interior self. So I'm living this stuff out, man. I'm wrestling with it. This is real time.
And yeah, so real. Yeah. And I love how, you know, in your book, you unpack these different practices. You talk about the Lord's Prayer. And again, this so much wisdom from the contemplative tradition, which I appreciate. And you're someone who's constantly tried to live that out. I'd love to hear, I know that you've also, and how do you balance that, Rich, your interior work, and yet you have definitely stepped into this role as a prophetic voice in our generation as well, especially as it relates to race, for instance, you know, and I'd love to hear just what's it been like for you leading your congregation in the last few months. And New Life, for those of you who don't know, is an incredibly diverse congregation from vast, you know, socio-political spectrums. And you've been someone who's been navigating not only your interior world, but also leading the conversation around race. I'd love to hear from you. Just, and I know that you address some of this in your book as well, which is, this is why I think your book is so needed, because it integrates so much of this. But would love to hear from you about the topic of race and leadership.
Yeah, I like to think I live in this dialectical tension of Gustavo Gutierrez, Peruvian liberation theologian, would talk about theology as theology is critical reflection upon praxis. And so for liberation theologians, the assumption is that you are beginning with praxis and then reflecting upon it, that the urgency is to act, to pray, to march, to march, to act. At the same time, the dialectical tension that I live with is that I am deeply shaped by the contemplative tradition, which believes that our doing flows from our being. And so, what is it? Am I supposed to pray first or act first? What does the chicken or the egg come first? And in an ideal world, those are neat, fixed, easy categories in which there is a logical first step and then second step. But I don't live in that space. And so I do know that I need rhythms to be with God daily and practicing silence daily. And at the same time, I know out of that place of reflection, what does it mean to bring a word from God? And whether that's coming from the congregation or in leaders that I'm training or at a protest that I'm praying at. You know, how do I hold that together? And it's not easy. I don't think there's any good answer. However, I think the hope is that the dialectical is being held together and is named. And which is why seasons of sabbatical, like James talked about, Sabbath. I mean, if there's one thing that you're not going to take from me is Sabbath rhythms. And so every 7 days for 24 hours, I'm really good at not picking up the phone. I'm really good at not praying with a congregant who needs prayer during my Sabbath. I'm really good at that, Drew. And there are times in my 12 years of being a pastor that I probably broken my Sabbath maybe 3 times, and because it was a legitimate emergency that I had to respond to. But I'm really good at saying, you know what, this problem didn't start yesterday and is not going to end tomorrow. You can call me on Sunday or Monday. And so those rhythms, I think, are really important for me. And note, Jesus did the same thing. I mean, some of the most heartbreaking stories in the Gospels is when Jesus heals and then he says, all right, we have to go. I always wonder, Lord, what about the 4 other families whose kid was sick and needed healing? You know, are you just going to leave them? And it seems as if Jesus, with great lament and grief, would have to leave, because if he didn't leave, he'd be consumed himself. And there's no easy answers here, but I think for me, Drew, it's those rhythms of Sabbath, and I mean, this is my prayer chair, reflection, and then hopefully out of that place. But it's this dialect there. You know, do I begin with action? Do I begin with prayer? I think the answer is yes at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, Rich, we're winding down this conversation. Just any last words related to, just as you were to encourage folks. And again, I want to just make one plug again for, if you haven't picked up A Deeply Formed Life, I know that it's also, you've created a resource for churches as well to use to work through. If you can just recap those 5, you know, the 5 values, themes, and then.
Yeah, for me, and the book for me is what I like to term, it's an ambitious reframing of spiritual formation, where I have learned much from the Dallas Willards, the Richard Fosters, the John Ortbergs, all the white people that are writing about spiritual formation. And yet I realize that spiritual formation is not something that needs to be written about from the monastery or the mountaintop. I think it can be done with sirens blaring down Queens Boulevard and with people running into the subway and with music blasting across the street from our neighbor. I think these are possible. And so the 5 values very simply are contemplative rhythms, racial reconciliation. And because James is on this call here and we've had many conversations about reconciliation, I will just say for James that I use that word with great ambivalence, reconciliation, because I don't want a text message from James and after this call.
Wow, stop bugging. Stop bugging. That's how Queens do it. That's how Queens do it. I know you're from Brooklyn.
I'm from Brooklyn, bro. And so I mean, so I use justice and reconciliation somewhat in interchangeable ways, but anyway, let me move on. Interior examination, sexual wholeness, and missional presence. And so for me, it's the convergence and the concurrent kind of formation that we can chew gum and walk at the same time. And we need not be a church that's only a church of justice, or a church on prayer, or a church on we're good with therapy and such. I think we need to hold all these things together. So for me, this is what I like to think is an ambitious reframing of spiritual formation.
Wow, thanks, Rich.